not be able to work his way through the health system in a way that would have resulted in reasonable outcomes and end up passing away. And so our first investigation was really with the hospital leadership that was where he had his surgery and returned for the emergency. But we were fortunate that the Health Quality Council of Alberta was actually doing studies into the different cracks in the system there and trying to raise public awareness and to cause improvement to happen there, and making it clear what the potential outcomes were if things weren't fixed. The leader of that investigation was a fellow named Dr. Warren Flemons. And when they started that investigation, they took the unique step of inviting us into their boardroom so that we actually had the opportunity to learn what they were learning, and they could learn from us what we had learned and what we felt about what had happened to Greg. And that wasn't a short process. It was most of a year that we spent every week or every other week in their boardroom having the conversations and helping to develop a report that in the end was released in December of 2013. It's called the Continuity of Patient Care Study. It produced 13 recommendations and had lessons learned from our perspective on things that the public shouldn't do, like make assumptions about what's happening. And it also included reviews of work done and systems outside of Canada and what they had potentially to offer in terms of what the recommendations should be here. Dr. Flemons also is a professor at the University of Calgary Cummings School of Medicine, and in his work he teaches safety and quality improvement. And he asked us if he could take and create some video clips that he could use in that instruction, because in the time that relatively short time that he and I had been invited to speak to conferences, him talking about the medical side of what happened to Greg and me being able to provide a little bit of perspective about who Greg was. He noticed that the impact was stronger when both sides were available. So he thought having video clips would in fact do that part of the equation. And it evolved forward from there, being, instead of a series of video clips, it ended up being what you've seen today as a 30-minute docudrama, if you like, in terms of what main things that happened to Greg going through the system. So once we have that to work with and the combination of the report, it makes us as Greg's family in a much stronger position for people to be able to understand and not simply think this is a one-off thing, that no one else needs to really worry about it, because there are a lot of things that are happening in common with Greg's journey throughout the system. And in Teri's case, she's done a couple of these screenings at international conferences where other parts of the world speak about some of the same culture and some of the lack of system things that are happening in other countries as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? You do the UFC part. 14 minutes.
Yeah, so along with the 30-minute film that you just watched, we also shot, it's a total of 14 minutes of additional scenes that the University of Calgary is using to reinforce the importance of teamwork in healthcare. So the film, along with those teaching scenes and some workshops, have been fully embedded into the medical school at the University of Calgary, and actually the University of Toronto Medical School has started to use the film and some of that same teamwork framework here. So we're really excited about the spread and the fact that the film is being used to spark discussion, but it's continually embedded throughout the training at UC. I think it's 13 hours in total that the curriculum touches on bringing themes from the film and from Greg's story into what they're teaching at the med school. So yeah, that was the original trigger for doing the project, was being excited about the potential to have an impact on future doctors. But for me, it was the second day of shooting when I started to see some of the stills of the product that the team was actually getting, that I realized that there was going to be potential to have an impact with the film well beyond just the med school classroom, and that's a lot of what we've been doing over the last year, is sharing it with a whole bunch of different audiences and trying to get different perspectives, because I think really to improve the system as a whole, and we've always felt that it was a system failure, it wasn't an individual that caused Greg's death, that we need to have those different perspectives in the room, like getting the bright minds together to try and come up with solutions that'll actually cause a shift and fix some of the problems that lots of people experience in the healthcare system. Yeah, the only other thing I'll add in, we were so grateful for the team that was involved, the casting crew on the film. We never started out thinking that we would end up with this level of quality in a short film, but just sort of some fortunate relationships. Somebody that works down the hall from Ward runs with Andrew Reggett, who wrote the script, and Andrew had worked quite a bit with Dean Bennett, who directed, and Dean has been the longtime director of the Heartland TV show on CBC, and so he has a lot of really strong relationships and a lot of respect in the film industry in Alberta, and managed to pull together a really high quality professional casting crew, which you see in the result of the short film. So I think we probably can open up.
Get the experts to join us.
Yeah.
Just while they're moving up, I'll just comment that each time we do this, our goal is to try and support improvement and foster change, and we're learning from the audiences and how to do this in a way that helps us prepare for being able to use this more and more. So it's your questions and your comments that are helpful to us, and you don't have to worry about the character of those questions or comments. We've probably covered most of the waterfront in terms of what people have asked us, so you don't have to be bashful about it. You can, if we can't handle it, we'll hand it off to the two experts here and we'll be fine. So I don't know whether you want to do introductions.
Sure. Yes, so Ross Baker, professor in IHPME at UT, and quality leader in North America and the world. He is one of the big things that many things Ross is known for is, what, 10 or 13 years ago, he published a paper in Canadian Medical Association Journal that claimed that someplace between 9,000 and 23,000 Canadians are killed by medical error every year, based on analysis of thousands of medical records and the errors and problems that came up. So and asked Ross to join us on the panel. Michael Ratliff is Dr. Michael Ratliff. He is
I'm also a professor at
a professor in IHPME. He is a health policy advisor, and I met Michael after I heard 15 years ago he was on CBC in the morning talking about how healthcare needed queuing systems. And I just about fell out of bed and called him immediately. And so Michael's been a close associate ever since. Thank you very much for both coming and joining this thing. So I think first of all I'd like to open up to the audience a little bit and see if any comments, reactions, thoughts, anything surprising? Yeah.
So in addition to the bureaucratic, in addition to the bureaucratic cracks and lack of follow-up and that, which was obvious in the film, to me there was also the indication that a lot of the doctors clearly operated, if I can use that term, in their own silos. And they kind of knew what they were doing, and there's no need to consult with anybody else. Saw that certainly with the urologist, and I think at the end with the ER doctor, with respect to the clot and so on. It's kind of like we sort of know what's best, and no need to look elsewhere. So to me, there were kind of those two aspects: the bureaucratic follow-up and lack of time and appointments and that kind of stuff, and then the second one, the individual medical personnel involved.
Yeah, those comments are very valid, and I think they're related if you think about it, because one of the key things we think, and Teri referenced the idea of trying to influence the culture of the system by being able to have new docs have a chance to learn the teamwork skills that actually change that character from being more of a vertical or hierarchical system into one that's more of a flat teamwork-based one. But for us, it's both sides of that equation that needs to change, because as the public or patients generally even people inside the healthcare system, when they move on the other side of the table, you're beholden to the provider. And you're less able, don't feel as strongly about being able to engage. And it goes, in our case, we believe, all the way from the receptionist who took the phone calls or accepted the 19-day interval as being appropriate for an urgent CT scan. They all need to feel like they're empowered and more prepared to be a strong member of the team along with the patient, to have the doctor, in order to affect achieving the goal with the care. So you've touched on sort of the core thing, one of the three key things we believe that we want to highlight, and that is that culture change, and it's a broad definition of culture change. I don't know if you guys want to.
So I just had some questions.
I just had some questions about your interaction with the hospital at the time when you sort of were investigating what had happened. And I think, you know, over the course of the last few years, and certainly from the last decade, there's been a big shift in how patient safety is viewed within the hospital setting. And so I'm just curious as to, at the time when you were doing this, and now as you see all the change that's kind of enacted through all this culture change and through your initiatives, that, you know, have you seen a change in how a hospital may have interacted with you, kind of looking into error, system error, and, you know, was it antagonistic, and that sort of thing?
Well, I'll do the first part of that, and then I'll let the experts talk about what they've seen through their research and their work as well. But from our perspective, what started out was a pretty defensive culture, and one that really kept the cards close to the vest as far as the acute care world and all of the administration associated with it. And it's true, we've seen a change in the last 3 years, I would say, mostly, where there's more willingness now to talk about the challenges and try and figure out solutions to those challenges. But it's a long ways to go yet, really, because it takes that fundamental culture to shift, because what you have to do is give up your power as an individual that has the information and the potential to change, and share that with others through that conversation, and to look outside to see who is doing what better, and then engage in that process. And there are a lot more voices now that are willing to take the step about, okay, we admit we've got some challenges, what are the solutions? But it's still a challenge to affect change from that perspective, and that's a chunk of what we're trying to do, is to provide a platform on which they can speak, and we can support that, and the public needs to do that. The one thing you have to recognize is the ultimate leaders of the system or non-system are politicians. It gets there. And so now, change, no matter what it is a risky business for a politician. And so now you just have that negative pressure on innovation and change happening just by the character of the structure and who has charge of it. So that's where we believe the larger team, which includes the public and people like yourselves, have to be well enough informed that we together can move that needle, because without moving it, we'll continue to get what we have. I'll let the other guys talk, because they've been at this a lot longer than we have.
I think you've contributed a lot already, so I wouldn't minimize that. So Michael mentioned that 15 years ago, I co-led a study of adverse events, as we call them in healthcare. And adverse events are unintended. We're not talking about intentional harm, but unintended harm results from the care that patients receive, and leads to at least a prolongation of hospital stay, temporary disability, permanent disability, and sometimes death. And we did that study because the Americans had some 5 years before that released a major study and a report from the Institute of Medicine in the US called "To Err is Human," that really created this tsunami of activity to focus on patient safety as a critical issue in the American healthcare system. And Peter and I were working on similar issues here, and we both said at the time, okay, so the Americans have released this report, and now everybody in Canada is gonna recognize that we have the same problems, so we're gonna deal with it. And what happened was not that. What happened was that people said, oh my God, another problem with the American healthcare system. Aren't we glad we don't have the same problems here? And in fact, there was a prominent physician, I won't say who it was, who was quoted in a major Canadian newspaper who said, you know what, this is just, again, a sign of the deficiencies of US healthcare. And so Peter and I said, you know, the only way to make this a visible issue is to do it in Canada. And we recruited a team of people across the country to work with us. It took us a couple of years to do that, and then we released this report, and there was a tsunami of activity here. And the government created the Canadian Patient Safety Institute at that time, and governments across the country announced new initiatives, new funding to deal with a wide range of safety issues. Well, that was 2004, which is 15 years ago. And I have to say right now, if you look at the data haven't significantly changed since that time. There are some areas where there's been some results, but at the same time, there's a variety of other problems. And the kinds of things that we looked at are not the problems that Greg had and other people had in the system, which is really the coordination of care between different providers, right? And you can't point to any one situation that's at fault here, because there's a number of test results that weren't reported, a number of referrals that weren't followed up on, a number of failures of communication between people in different parts of the system. It's shockingly banal. That's the problem. It's shockingly banal, this. And I don't know if I bet most people in this room have been in a situation where you've had tests ordered by your family physician and made the assumption that if something was wrong, they would follow up with you, right? We all have that sort of. Myself, sometimes I say, my God, I should call and just make sure that something didn't. That there's no safeguard. There's no back check here. Healthcare is a very important part of our social fabric in the society, but it's a bunch of individuals and individual organizations, and there's very little responsibility for the system as a whole. The Deputy Minister of Health in Ontario is not responsible for the coordination of care at a local level, right? So the problem we face is that we make the assumption, because we have so many smart people in healthcare, we do have smart, capable people, that the system runs well. And that's a dangerous assumption to make. There are no other high-risk industries. The oil industry, the nuclear power industry, the aviation industry, that don't have well-developed, system-oriented safety management systems. There are no other ones, right? Healthcare is an exception to that, and it's because of the history, the politics, the policies that have developed, and the sort of difficulties of addressing the professional power base in healthcare. So we have an opportunity, we have a challenge, we have an opportunity here. The challenge is that unless we change the system, we can't expect to change the results. There are other great prices out there right now, and we have to be aware of the fact that there was no one individual, there's nobody you could really hang this one on. It was a system issue, as you've said. So what do we do? How do we create a system where we bring in not only the medical expertise and the healthcare expertise in general, but the expertise of people who are used to understanding safety systems at a system level, right? And Mike said, so say a little bit about how engineers can contribute to that. And I would say the biggest contribution that you could make, or your colleagues could make, is by letting people understand that there's a different path on this. It's not just a question of individuals being responsible for their own practice, which of course they are. It's about figuring out how as a system we build in the monitoring capabilities and the design capabilities that would allow us to create a safer system. Nobody designed the current system. It just evolved, over time with all the warts that it has in it. And very rarely do people go back and look at it, even when there's a major event like this. This is a big thing in Alberta now to have written this report and to go back and now talk about this, but it's not the usual approach to this. Most people see these as one-off issues and they make sort of limited recommendations. But to go back and say, so how do we design a system of interaction between the primary care providers and the specialists to make sure that communication is more effective? And other people are doing it, right? This is not just an issue in Canada. There was an article just before Christmas that said in Britain they've now banned the use of fax machines in medical offices in Britain because they're so prone to failure, right? And if the fax doesn't get delivered, who knows, right? So, you know, it's 2019, right? Let's start to figure out how we can use the information communication technologies that we've developed and use so effectively in so many other industries in healthcare, right? That's where you guys can play a role in this because it's not the usual expertise of people working in healthcare. We need to infuse that with people who have a different kind of expertise.
Thank you, Russ. Michael?
Thank you. And I want to thank the Price family so much for being courageous and taking from the ashes, literally, this phoenix that's been created, and hopefully will do great work, because you can't sort of dismiss that this happened, and I totally agree with what Ross was saying, that this is banal. Only, you know, truly bad things, truly evil things can only happen if they're banal. So I'm actually an adjunct professor at IHPME. I'm a public health physician, and I'm mainly part-time teaching public health physicians policy and communications. So I'm going to go in that direction to start my contribution here. And one of the points I want to make is where it's all connected, is that you can see a lot of the processes that should be improved. I'm relentlessly focused on process, and some to the point that even my kids in their 30s hate being with me, because you should see me in airports, right? Although they're a lot better organized than the healthcare system, and but I'm relentlessly focused on improving process, and I know that you need policies to support that. So, for example, right now, absolutely live, like the bullets are flying right now on this issue, because the College of Physicians and Surgeons in Ontario has a consultation that they're sort of towards the end of now on a draft continuity policy, continuity of care policy. And that over time, the medical associations like the Alberta Medical Association, the Ontario Medical Association, they've moved a little bit, but they have to defend their worst actors. And I'm not saying this is what unions do, they don't, but there is a fiduciary responsibility of an association to represent. And so they represent the people who want the least accountability for the most money. And they're relentlessly driven in that direction. That's why the OMA is in their third or fourth change of leadership in 12 months, because they can't possibly agree on anything except more money for everybody. They can't even figure out how to divide it, and there's less money for everybody. So they're going to continue being dysfunctional. The colleges have moved a lot further, and they are now have, I think, a majority of public members by a small margin in Ontario. But they are still mainly, it's physicians, it's better physicians. So my old friend and war partner, Phil Berger, is now in the College of Physicians and Surgeons. And that's great. But they are still trying to move from the 19th century to the 20th century and being beaten back. So they have a continuity of care draft policy out, which has 4 sections, one of which includes following up tests. And they are going to lose this. I've been telling Philip, actually, ever since he told me with great gusto that this was going to happen. I said, where's your policy analysis? Where's your political strategy? This has been defeated before. In Manitoba, it's actually been defeated twice, because the Ontario Medical Association or the Ontario Rheumatology Association, which is a branch of the OMA, they are massively critical of this and see this as part of an overall societal assault on doctors. And they don't, the average physician, at least in leadership positions in these groups, does not distinguish between the College of Physicians and Surgeons, the leadership of whom is all doctors, and government. They see them as the same nasty people. So that this is again, none of you probably know anything about this, but there are people right now defending the status quo, which would lead to more people like Greg Price dying. And it's happening as we talk. We don't know who they are right now. It can be hard to find out in the future, but it's happening right now. So we need to change these policies, but how are we going to do it? How are we going to, because the policy that the College of Physicians and Surgeons in Ontario is trying to implement now is baby steps. Other healthcare systems, good healthcare systems, would look at this and say, this is totally inadequate, what you want. But it's likely to actually be lost, or at least to be lost in good part, this particular battle. So how do you do this stuff? And why are we still, because once you look at it, you see that notwithstanding, it's so obvious that things have to change with the story of Greg's terrible problems. And then you find out that down in the weeds, because to do policy, you have to get down into the weeds. You have to find the rules. You have to make friends with lawyers and do all sorts of things that you might not want to do. Because otherwise you won't know what's actually turning that wheel, right? As engineers, you wouldn't accept a black box that was doing something structural, right? You want to know what's in there. You have to know the black box. This is the black box of policy. And it is likely to not necessarily be a win for our side. So how do you do this better? Number one, we have to be engaged. We're changing culture, we're changing society, we're changing the way that doctors in particular see themselves. Other healthcare providers too, but especially doctors. And there's only two other groups in society who have more control over what they do. Lawyers, which is why I have completely dysfunctional court systems with queuing issues that none of us could really understand, because it's run by lawyers and they don't know anything about engineering. And the worst actually would be churches and my faith synagogues and others. They will never change, right? It just takes, you have to wrest millions of people away from the main sect every 500 years, and that's how change occurs in religion. So, but what we're talking about is political change, and therefore we need politicians to engage this cause. And again, we may see that they're not so likely to do the right thing, but without them there can be no change. And we need politicians to champion this. The barriers that I see in Canada, and particularly in Ontario, are that for politicians to lead something, they are going to be opposed by their civil servants. Because when you are engaged in a political campaign, you might not win, you might lose. And people who are civil servants have very low tolerance for any risk whatsoever. Politicians have more appetite for risk, but once they're in office, that it is amazing that their deputy minister is telling them not to do something. And it could be the Premier's office on them too, but mainly they're told, don't rock the boat. And we've been told in Ontario for 15 years by the previous government, which is why I don't think they were, one of the reasons why they weren't as successful as they could have been, is we know what to do, we're gonna talk to so-and-so, don't make waves, we'll work it out. That's not the way politics works. The way politics works is, to make change on this, you have to have representatives of the Ontario Medical Association, and I'm embarrassed to say the Ontario chapter of the King College of Family Physicians, which usually is quite moderate, they oppose this policy by the College of Physicians and Surgeons in Ontario. Okay? So you need to get those representatives at a public meeting. You need to have the gravitas of chair and organizing group to make sure they come. And then you need to have people like the Prices and others who can tell their stories. And then you need to have an event where the community leader, a business leader, a religious leader, a union leader, somebody who just is turned to when we've got 50 people homeless, what are we going to do? That kind of person. You want that person to turn to the lead doctor in their community and say, it looks like we would have way fewer deaths like Greg Price if you change the way you do your work. I don't want you to be paid any less, but I want you to completely change the way you do your work and come into the 21st century. I'm sorry I don't want to take even more time than I have already, but I'm trying to outline, first of all, that we need policy change to make this happen. There are very specific policies we have to get behind. Most of the time, we are busy fighting battles where they're not being fought. The battle on this particular issue to prevent more Greg Price situations occurring is right now, to the College of Physical Surgeons, none of us are involved with that action. The only ones who are really involved are the people who are trying to defend the status quo. And to change these policies, we need to have smarter political processes which are public and engage patients. And we need to stop listening to people who want to have rules, meetings according to, whatever those rules are where you can't talk outside the meeting. Because unless somebody like the President of the OMA and others are so embarrassed by their defense of the status quo and then can transmit that embarrassment to their membership, then we're not going to get the significant change we need. So that's my initial response. Thank you, Mike, for inviting us.
Well, thank you. Gail?
Hi. I just recently experienced what you're talking about. I have a cardiac history, and I had some GI problems, and my GI physician tried to contact my cardiologist to get input on how she could go forward with regard to medication, etc. And they never responded back to her. And one of the things that I had difficulty with as well was getting through the secretaries. The secretaries act as guardians, and they don't let you get through to the doctor, to talk to the doctor, get questions answered, etc. They are a big part of the problem.
Yeah, those are all very true, and the challenge is like what we try to do, and I'm sure your thought process is you try and step back far enough to identify why they behave like that, right? You're trying to figure out what the underlying causal factors are to cause them to behave like that. As a society, we've actually, right across the country, but especially in our home province, the compensation model pays for transaction and speed. And so now you've got management systems in place that chase that. So you've got Michael outlining why they're defending, well, we don't want to have after hours care because we want to be able to do lots of transactions in a short period of time and don't bother me about the rest of the time, right? So you need to think about it that way and then be able to try and understand what you need to change behind the scenes in order to create the right behavior. We've done it upside down.
Can I just add to Mike, to hers, because one of the things, and I saw the same thing where Greg suggested something about the clock. So she had been told by the GI doctor to drop her anticoagulant for the procedure she was going to have, and for 5 days. And it just didn't sound right to me, because I know the risk of stroke and everything else. And I had to push her to basically push back, and finally they put her back on the anticoagulant for the procedure. But she knew it wasn't right, but she wasn't prepared to, quote, question. And I think that's part of the thing that often happens is, well, they know best, so I shouldn't question. And sometimes it takes a, quote, disinterested or loving third party to be involved as well, to try and push back. I thought I'd add that to it.
Scott? Trigger alert, Scott is an ED doc.
So I just wanted to sort of jump back to the idea of which, like these different industries that have safety cultures and how maybe they evolved to encompass that in the first place. And I think, when you think about the public's viewpoint on nuclear power industry and the safety system that should exist there, I think every person would wholeheartedly agree that this is something that needs to have safety checks above what, engineers or system level people may have done. We need to have that rock solid. And then aviation, obviously if a plane goes down, it's public outcry, it's 300 lives lost immediately or more. And then you start thinking about healthcare or even other industries. I think most interestingly, the recent one is the financial industry, which never really had much of a safety check system. And then the market goes down in 2008, and all of a sudden it's now listed as one of these industries that's in critical need of safety infrastructure to prevent that sort of thing. And the idea of public knowledge and awareness of such bad things happening. So obviously it took the stock market to crash for people to identify the financial industry as needing the system. But what does the healthcare system need before we realize that that's happening? And unfortunately, healthcare is often a very individual thing. It's a person's interaction with the system, not the population's interaction with the system. And so these negative outcomes that happen aren't publicized, aren't brought into the limelight, and they're often so personal that it's often not desired. So obviously what you guys are doing is trying to do that, is trying to push this into the limelight and bring this idea of public awareness, because I agree that politicians certainly need to be on board, but politicians are more easily swayed by the population than by what top-down approaches should happen. And so I think if you had people like banging the doors down saying like, I'm afraid of our healthcare system, that there would be a lot more change that happens. And I think that that's really the output we need to have, is get people pissed off, frankly.
Well, it's a big task, because one of the things that happens in between where we are and what you're talking about is that the public first needs to be interested in that. And it's a lot more comfortable to believe what you're told in that we've got the best in the world and not think about it, right? Because it's not disconcerting. If we've got the best, then I can just cruise. Now, what we have to do is get people along the path so that they understand that it isn't the best. And even if it was, we shouldn't sit back and say we don't need to improve. Right? We should always have that. And that's the difference with the other industries, really. There's all kinds of public safety acts, Transportation Act, the food side. Basically, you can name them. Right? What you do as engineers in designing things, you don't just go off on your own and say, oh, I'm going to do this. You've got all kinds of codes that you have to meet. Right? But in healthcare, there isn't any. Right? There's none. Like we're from ag and food. That's my background. I'm a farmer, and we do meat processing and do all the way to retail. And what we have to have in place is a plan called HACCP, which is Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points, that was developed by NASA. And we have to have, when we produce a pound of meat that goes out as a steak, we have to have every possible potential risk covered in writing before we can operate. Before we can operate. Now, the people that give us a license to operate a food establishment are the same people that accept a 1 in 25 chance of when you go into the hospital, you get something that you didn't enter with. Now, if we had 1 in 25 patrons leave with foodborne illness, our doors would be closed. That's the kind of mindset that you have to start to have the public appreciate, because right now what we do is we just compartmentalize that and say, oh, well, that was just an unfortunate thing, too bad, so sad, but it's not going to happen to me. Right?
Hi, thank you so much for this. My uncle passed away a couple of years ago from pancreatic cancer through a similar kind of failure of the system, so I it's really great to hear that you're trying to bring this message out and spread it and create awareness through the public. Because I am an industrial engineer from UT and have worked a bit in different areas of the healthcare system, a couple of hospitals, and am now working at Cancer Care Ontario. And the challenge that I can see for engineers working in the healthcare system trying to bring about some of these changes that are so needed is that it is a very individualized healthcare system, even to the extent where hospitals really act as individuals, and then the doctors within the hospitals act as individuals, and so creating some kind of continuity for patients is really a challenge. And I think for engineers that are working within individual institutions, they really have an opportunity there to create some continuity and streamline processes within that hospital. And then I come from a Cancer Care Ontario side where we're working at a provincial level, trying to create some improvements within the system, also related to funding, and of course the funding models also perpetuate some of these problems. But the challenge that we have on that side that I can see is that although we're trying to create some of these improvements, we're still limited in how much we can do because the hospitals still operate independently. So we can't go down to the system level of saying, you know, hospitals shouldn't be sending faxes to each other, they should be finding another way to communicate. So I think we're still at a point where, in terms of what engineers can do, it's still a bit fragmented. And I think creating some kind of public awareness to get some kind of policies that enable engineers to create some system improvements, but at a level that is system-wide, but still granular enough that it actually directly affects patients as they go through that journey is really, really needed. And hopefully more engineers will start to move into those spaces so that it's also, I guess from the medical perspective, they can also see the benefits that engineers can bring to improving some of these processes.
Well said. Yeah, and you know, I think that there are some rays of hope here. The fact that there's a growing interest in involving patients, like the Prices, in discussions about how to redesign the system. It's no longer a question of an internal change process. Many hospitals are now putting patients into all committees, board committees down to frontline work, improvement teams, and that changes the dialogue, right? So, you know, if you don't put new people into the room, then you always have the same sort of relationships, which are dictated by you know, professional power and long history of, you know, who gets to call the shots. But as soon as you put the patient in the room, it changes the dynamic significantly. And so that's something we're seeing everywhere. It's being encouraged through accreditation policies. It's being encouraged through a variety of different initiatives across the country. And it's an international movement to involve patients and caregivers in more explicitly in healthcare, and to understand their perspective and to use their perspective to help redesign what happens. So that's a big plus for all of us moving forward. And I think the other piece is that we are recognizing that the power of digital information flow will democratize healthcare eventually, right? So you know, healthcare is one of the slowest industries to take these ideas up. But we've seen so many other industries, you know, banking, finance generally, and a variety of other industries just transformed with a more consumer-focused element to them. And healthcare is on that same curve. Slow, because there's lots of objections being raised in terms of privacy issues and competing technologies and so forth. But I actually think this is the piece that will break the existing superstructure that maintains the status quo. Because if you can get, I mean, I don't know how many people have my chart at Sunnybrook or UHN or one of the other hospitals that's making that available now. You get to see your test results sometimes before your physician sees the test result, right? It changes the conversation, and it changes some of this opportunity to ensure that the results don't get lost in the midst. And so I'm an optimist, right? Because I think the current environment has provided us with some of the tools that are necessary. What's missing is the leadership impetus to say, let's really take advantage of that. But I can say even that's changing as well. So for my sins, as somebody interested in quality and safety, I'm now sitting on the board of UHN. And let me tell you, they are totally committed to this idea of sharing information with patients. And there was a lot of pushback from some physicians at UHN saying, this is really unsettling for us because our patients will learn about these results before we have a chance to explain them to them. And they were really worried about the potential reaction from them. Guess what? It hasn't been a problem. There are occasionally situations where people need to provide additional information. Most of that is a positive attribute to the system. And the other piece on this is the coordination piece. So if you have good information communication technologies in place, it makes it so much easier to deal with these kinds of coordination of care issues because there's a digital connection and you're not relying on human memory or really fallible reminder systems that we saw that let Greg down significantly. So let's figure out how we can encourage that to move faster. And part of that is going to be, frankly, the impulse of especially our larger hospitals to want to be at the front end of these technologies and not wait, right? UHN doesn't want to see Sunnybrook ahead of them. So they're working as hard as they can, much as Calgary doesn't want to see Edmonton be ahead of it. So I think actually that this is a huge opportunity to get in and to say, okay, so the technology is there, but the critical issue is how do we link that technology? How do we design it in such a way that we maximize its capabilities?
I just reinforce that by saying, as engineers, you should take a piece of your blue sky time and think about things that you can reach out and grab while the rest of the system is sitting there gazing at their navel, trying to think about the little bits of incremental change. Because that's the culture of the system, is it's adverse to looking outside. You know more of what else is going on and what potential is and how you can do that big leap forward. And I agree completely that the force that's coming can't be resisted in terms of feeding the appetite of individuals wanting to know more about their own health and more about their potential treatment paths and making those choices. And it won't matter how many people tell us, well, you really shouldn't have the information because we don't trust you with it. Sorry, that's mine. I'll figure it out.
Radiologist.
Yeah.
And X-ray.
Sorry.
I think that was from another room.
I hope now I'm hearing myself. First, I'm not a native speaker, so I don't know if I'm expressing myself well, but I really want to commend you for doing this with your team. It's incredibly important, I think. Like the ED physician, I work in acute care. I'm a radiologist. And I just want to share some observations because I'm from the Netherlands, brought up in a completely different healthcare system. And I think I can, both on society as well as the healthcare system, I can talk for hours on the differences, good and bad. And I want to preempt it by saying, I'm not saying that the Dutch system is better, it's different. One of the differences that has struck me always is that when you get care in Canada, you're assigned to one doctor instead of a continuous team that almost works in shifts, which makes, in part, it makes it less accessible because your doctor knows you best if you see him continuously. But the continuity of care is, in my opinion, better
with a system that rotates, even though there's some noise in the handovers that go along with it, but it's more accessible in total. The other thing that's struck me a bit is that I did my training as a radiologist, and I went to Vancouver to do a fellowship for 2 years. One was in trauma and emergency radiology, and one was in musculoskeletal radiology. And in that second year, there was about a 9-month wait list for MRs. All communication went through the doctor's office and fax. And in the Netherlands, whatever is needed, you communicate one-on-one with the patient, and now it's actually electronic. They can book their appointments for whatever service just in a schedule online that they can, and you get an SMS the day before reminding you that you actually are due for your appointment. Again, there's good and bad things, because if you do it through the doctor's office, your doctor is aware. I don't know if in the engineering world this gives opportunities and that you can take away from that, but there are some changes that are not like at the highest level that I think we can achieve without overturning policies, and I do think that some of that actually is an accreditation and making patient contribution mandatory, or have these performance indicators that say an oncology patient should be treated within 6 weeks of their first presentation. On the doctor side, I want to say Canadian doctors work extremely hard, and they are unbelievably knowledgeable when you compare them to the Dutch. I always say, if I have a very rare disease, I would much rather be here. If I would have a fairly common disease, I would rather be in the Netherlands, because the thing that I think that the systems are different, but probably maybe on par, I don't know. But the team player here, a surgeon or someone else would manage the diabetes of their patients themselves. In the Netherlands, a surgeon wouldn't know how to, so they would call the specialist on that topic, and that has created a culture where phone calls between doctors happen incredibly often. It's just observations again. I don't want to say one is better than the other. It's a difference of system, but I really want to thank you for doing this, because that's key that this gets brought out. That any system has their flaws and needs improvement. That goes without saying. In the Netherlands as well, we have those issues.
Thank you for that. I think too, one of the things that really struck me about the story with Greg's story is that he wasn't very sick, and so I had this mental model that if you're really sick in Canada, you get great care. You know, you show up at the emergency department, and the urgent system works well, and it's the not that sick. It's the triage level 3s and 4s that fall through the cracks. That's where the cracks are, and the handoffs, etc. But one of the things too that the collaboration. One of the things that occurred to me is that with collaboration among docs, is that professors, like I should be collaborating with my colleagues. I see them once a year. You know, like we don't talk. Why? Because I'm too busy, right? Like I'm drowning, right? So in order to encourage doctors to collaborate and cooperate, we need the systems to allow them to do it automatically, right? Like 85%, I think we're up to 85% of GPs now in Ontario have electronic medical records that don't talk to anybody. And we're like, why?
Can I just throw something in, Mike? Again, sort of trying to think how to close the loop. I have a saying with the students I teach that the status quo exists for unbelievably good reasons. Because there's a tendency, when you see stupid things, to think, oh, this is just stupid. The status quo is never stupid. It is always there for extremely good reasons. And so, again, to relentlessly focus on what is your practice, what's your process, what's your practice, what are your in-house policies, and then how does that connect with public policy? So that in Canada, for example, regarding MRIs, We may or may not have enough MRIs to do what we need to do, but we definitely need, there are people getting MRIs, including me last year, who don't need them. And that we have and we have a number of people who are not getting them. For example, if you take a look at who's getting MRIs of their hips, who's getting hip replacements, even though that's like twice to 3 times more common in people in the lowest socioeconomic groups than the highest, that typically your MRA scanning rates are the same across socioeconomic groups. So there's a lot of people, which is what we'd expect in Canada, it's been shown in other areas, who are getting certain high-tech services who don't need them, tend to be higher education, higher income, and other people not getting them. But the process, but it turns out that again, the provincial auditor just looked at this here, and I've looked at a lot of literature over the last couple of years. There's virtually no quality assurance around who orders the scan. There's much better quality assurance, particularly in teaching hospitals, I'm hoping, that regarding the reading of the scans, and hopefully every once in a while we do some inter-observer variation studies and stuff like this. But even for doctors who have privileges within a teaching hospital, there is not likely to be a formal report on what their MRI ordering is like. There's nothing that goes to community family doctors who are in the majority of these. And in fact, there is no quality assurance at all of on a routine basis, with very minor exceptions, for anything family doctors do in the community. Now, to bring this back to policy, the Ontario government for several years, but they can't explain their way out of a wet paper bag, because they tried for the last few years with another Baker Price report, to try to force family doctors in Ontario who don't have any other affiliation to be part of a local medical group. Just be part of a local medical group. Not even any details about how that would work. Some better doctors have been trying to push this for a number of years, although usually because of their colleagues' concerns, they'll want to make them voluntary. So that, and in every province, Alberta's got a little bit more than other provinces in this regard, but it's still absolutely nothing you'd expect from any high-risk industry, right? Most of you pilots, we're not going to do any monitoring at all of your performance. A few of you will scrutinize a little bit. So that there's, again, some very specific policies which should mandate that all family members in a community have to be part of a local medical group. That local medical group will have some assignments to it, which good health systems have. When I've worked in a few places, I haven't done any clinical work in 20 years, but I did clinical work at the Hassle-Free Clinic, a downtown sexually transmitted disease birth control clinic. I worked on the men's side, just doing sexually transmitted disease. And that every time a doctor saw a patient, the chart was reviewed. And by non-medical staff, and then every once in a while they would say, hey, what about this? And if there was a follow-up, those staff made sure that it happened, and if they needed to get a doctor because of some concern, they would get it. They were absolutely fail-safe. No one would ever get lost. So there's some of that can happen, but if we want any sort of assurance like we have when we get on a plane, that that there are systems in place to keep us safe, that we don't have to make sure we've got the right pilot. Do you ever get on a plane and say, well, I'm not flying with him. My family doctor says I need this pilot. So we want to have a healthcare system where that can happen. Here's another particular policy that the Ontario government flubbed badly because they had no political strategy for implementation. But it will come around again. So hopefully when these policies come around again, that we can actually be engaged as the public and patients in trying to make sure that the medical organizations, who mainly have good people working in them, actually don't maintain a status quo which is killing people.
Hi. My colleagues and I work for the Toronto Central LHIN, which is a health system planning and funder. And we came today to see if we can integrate any of this into the education we do. But I also wanted to share that in my previous role with the LIN, I worked in pretty much every hospital in the city, discharging clients to the community. And at least once a week, one of them would say to me, "You're the first person that has listened to me, actually listened to me my whole life." Which is pretty scary because I see them right as they're leaving, or I would have seen them right before they left. So what scares me the most about Greg's story is that he knew what was wrong with him. He said, "I think I have a blood clot," and he got dismissed. And it's really, really too bad that it takes somebody passing away before their voice can actually be heard in our system. So I'm just wondering, yes, we need to change policy. Yes, we need to change our structures and processes. But how do we get that voice to the doctors before somebody's dead? Do you know what I mean? It's not, I think you've been trying to answer that, but I just wanted to put that out there.
Well, from our perspective, it comes back to that culture and the ability to actually be able to have that two-way communication. You need to have willingness on both ends of the equation, but certainly in your case, the empathy you feel and the responsibility you felt in terms of ensuring that communication worked tends to get overburdened with the other things that we as a society expect out of the system. And that is that speed and payment, right? And so those are the things that we need to shift. If we can't actually have the right signals and the right motivators there, we really can't criticize the behavior. We can recognize it, but how are we going to fix it? Well, we need to work our way back up the decision tree, if you like, to the point where we see where that is driving the wrong behavior. Because we really, there's tremendous people. We've met a lot of tremendous people in the system. And a lot are trying to do work that is way harder than it should be. Way harder than it should be. Simply because we've got all this other noise and pressure on. And that's where we're at with burnout, as far as I'm concerned. The concerns on burnout is because people know here what they want to do, but they're so shackled down with all the stuff that's in the way that it makes it frustrating to the point of impossibility for them to actually do the job. So how do we as a public fix that? Well, we have to actually think about it in a way that says, okay, we got to join the team, and we have to figure out how to make this better for everybody, taxpayer, patient, and provider, and do it in a way that actually delivers a better care.
Yeah, the one thing I would just add and sort of touch on, I think the original part or the initial part of your question, we're really excited and optimistic about the teamwork curriculum that's been developed and the uptake of that so far. And initially we thought we were just going to have an impact on the med students at UC, and there's been a lot of interest in the use of the film and in the use of that teamwork curriculum, which I think is an important part as well. I kind of anticipated that there would be a small percentage that would be interested in having a really strong supported conversation around teamwork, but that the majority would just want to host a screening and have a discussion, and then it would kind of disappear. Right now we're getting lots of requests for the film, and about a third of the people want to be able to embed it in some kind of training program, or at least interested in seeing what we're doing with the teamwork framework. So I think that's a really positive sign, and that there's a lot of potential with the film. What we're doing for sharing it to enable teams like yours to be able to continue to potentially use the film yourself. Right now, we've been struggling over the last 2 months of trying to get over the finish line to sort of enable other organizations to host screenings without us being in the room, because there's been very few instances up until now where organizations have had screenings without us actually there. And it's partially the intent of it was because we learn a lot from the conversations and we're taking away a lot, and so it's set us up for the next phase. But we're at the point where we're kind of a bottleneck on the spread of the use of the film. We want people to be able to use it with their teams, and especially if they're interested in the education materials, to really embed and have those really good conversations about what good teamwork looks like and how that would have an impact on the care that patients receive and the way that their teams work together. And really, Dad and I keep thinking that we're kind of skimming over what we mean by teamwork, and what the U of C team is really pushing forward is that the patient and their family members or the network of people that they have around them are included on that team. And so when you're saying that everybody on the team has to have information, the kind of sharing of information that I think is coming anyway is a part of that. And some of the decisions on what technologies start to get implemented need to be technologies that enable that what good teamwork looks like. So we are in the next few months, or well, hopefully in the next month, because we need to sort of get across that line. We're setting up a way for people, I mean, you can request access to the film right now, and then we would work with you, but we're trying to get a consistent way so that organizations can request, be given a screening kit, sort of understand a bit of terms of use, kind of basic stuff, and really understand what we're hoping the impact of the film is, and then they can share it with their own teams, whether it's inside healthcare organizations or with it's just family and friends or other community groups or whatever the intent is. We do hope it spreads beyond just like physicians sharing with physicians. We've been excited about some of the impact and the conversations that's been had when a clinic shares it with the entire team, because some of those, it has an impact on receptionists and sort of raising issues that probably don't normally come up in conversations about how their team works together. And so we're trying to figure out the best way to replicate those good conversations and encourage going forward. So yeah, the next phase, well, we just referring to everything in 3 phases. The next phase, people will be able to get permission to use it, and ideally and then it'll be like scheduled limited access, and we're not expecting to charge for the use of the film, but we are hoping that people loop back around and say how it went, what they learned, what worked well, and potentially pay it forward if there's another similar. It's happening in Calgary and Edmonton right now. The diagnostic imaging teams in Calgary are using the film on their education days, and Edmonton is interested. And instead of myself or the UC team that developed the education materials talking to Edmonton, we're just getting the Calgary team to talk to Edmonton, because they already set it up for that exact same purpose of the education days with with all the diagnostic imaging techs, so they can set it up with the Edmonton team and sort of pay it forward without us necessarily needing to do a bunch of the sort of legwork around it. So that's kind of where we're at. We're hoping to have that sharing happening sooner rather than later. There'll be an online sort of collaboration community tool to sort of house those conversations and share the materials and the screening kits and information on what questions and even the technology, some of the stuff like making sure you turn off the lights because some of the scenes are really dark and you can't see them, like down to that sort of level of detail of how to host a screening. And then we're just hoping it'll sort of take on its path of its own.
One of the things I'm struggling with is, what do we do now? What do we do tomorrow? It's like, this was all very interesting and very moving, but what are we gonna do about it? What are you gonna do about it? And so I am trying to figure out, I mean, there's now been a model set up for medicine, for education. So how do we pass this on, and what do we do in terms of process engineering? How do we incorporate this? I'm incorporating it in my healthcare systems class. And the students in my class have a case next week. Teri's going to help us out online, but the case is to, what can we do? Like, what can we do next, etc. So I'm very interested in ideas, suggestions people have. Send to me later. Draw that now. Yeah.
The question, or the
Oh, I
comment
think there's
came up
somebody
with-
behind you that had a question.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
This is the question before this is before you had the concluding statement. But I was just, in the video, there was lots of points where tests were done and they were saying, if it's serious, they'll let you know, or they'll get back to you really soon. And like someone had said before, I think everyone's experienced that when you get tests in the healthcare system, they'll say, sometimes they'll just say, we'll only contact you if you need to follow up and things like that. And I was wondering, is that standard practice? And if so, what is the benefit behind, right? Obviously the the benefit of, telling them the results, whether good or bad, is that then okay, like I can forget that and it's fine, and it wasn't something that fell through the crack. What's the benefit of not telling them that there's nothing to worry about? Like, is it that big of a time for the doctors and the staff, or what's the reasoning behind that?
Well, if you had are you an engineer? Yeah. If you had a functional system which had multiple fail-safe, then it would be justified to say, you've got 6 sigma, 7 sigma on your process, so you can say, well, if there's no abnormality, then we won't get in touch with you and everything's fine. But given that healthcare typically operates at maybe 1 sigma, that there is, you can't do that. So just in terms of very practical things, I should say, notwithstanding maybe a bit of my doom-like talk, I am an optimist, or else I still wouldn't be doing this at my age. That there are some things that all of you can take away as quick lessons. Number 1, never go to a serious appointment about anything semi-serious without another person. You won't hear what's said, you won't remember. Number 2, you got to take notes. Number 3, that quickly, what is a team? Anybody, quick, what's a team? What's a team? Say it loud. A group of people. What are they? What are their two key characteristics?
They have similar interests.
They have common goals. What's the other thing?
They trust each other.
What's that?
They trust each other.
Yeah, but what's the other big thing that we want from teams? What's that? What's that?
They're working towards a common goal.
They're working towards a common goal. Yes, that's all that. What's the other thing? Key.
They
Yes.
differentiate roles.
No. Other thing. What's the key? The absolute key thing that we don't have when we talk about the teams in the healthcare system, usually. Common accountabilities. When, my team, the Winnipeg Jets, lost last night. Who lost? Was it the goaltender? Was it the forwards? It was the team. And in healthcare, my experience is that people are at pains to define teams in ways that nobody else defines teams. So, now, number 1, who is the captain of the team? It's the patient. The patient, and by which I mean patient, family, friends, they're the captains of the team. So if you're currently having anything that's going on in the healthcare system, it is your responsibility, shouldn't be, but it is your responsibility to make sure that things get followed up. And don't stop until you have followed things up. Secondly, if you're having problems dealing with the system, as you saw Greg having problems, get help. And again, all I'm talking about is how to fix the Swiss cheese temporarily. So this is just what you have to do now, not in a better system. But you're going to need to track everything, and you're going to need to contact people. Do you know a doctor? Do you know a nurse? You're well-educated people. You're likely to know somebody in the healthcare system. Go to them. If you're not fortunate enough to have a doctor in your family, go to them, because they have a nose, so that they know when the healthcare system is doing something banal that is unbelievably dangerous and that nobody else will catch. So there are some very concrete things that you can do personally, and then I would suggest that somebody set off something that will cause an issue at U of T. There is the IHI Open School. If any of you know about the IHI Open School here, just a few of you. Everybody else here needs to know about the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, which is based in the U.S., largest quality organization in healthcare, has open school chapters everywhere. U of T chapter is one of the best. There's lots of great stuff to get involved with. And then, instead of being patient, start sitting in your dean's offices, the dean of medicine's office, and other deans, and just insist that we have better interdisciplinary training. At the way we're doing team training now in healthcare, if we were doing this, in hockey, we would be on target to compete with the Russians in 2150 sometime, right? So that Canadian hockey used to be throw the stars together, we'll beat anybody, and it turned out you have to be a really effective team to beat other teams. So I would say that those are the concrete things you can do now individually in your life, and I would say the IHI Open School should just light a fire under every faculty that has students in it to make sure that this stuff doesn't get lost.
One more question.
You brought up, sir, the point about technology in the 21st century, and I was just thinking of technology, and you talked about thinking outside the box. Technology from another area, which often can work, is, I don't know a lot about Bitcoin, but I do know that that technology allows you, for example, allows Walmart to find out where a particular leaf of lettuce was grown, in terms of tracking salmonella and things like that. And it would seem to me that technology could have application in terms of, so stuff doesn't fall through the cracks, to make sure everything does get traced and followed up. So I don't know if anyone would make comments on that, but it's a technology I don't think has been applied very much in this area.
We have a project tracking where the particular part that went in your body came from, what lot number, et cetera, is right now it's in. And we're working on that. I would like to thank very much the panel, Teri and Dave in particular, that this is a marvelous opportunity for all of us, and thank you very much for bringing this. Thank you very much for doing this. This has been a lot of work. And thank Ross, thank Michael, this is terrific. Thank you very much.